Ultima Underworld is in many ways a legendary game which transformed the RPG juggernaut of Ultima into the first-person view, resulting in a classic dungeon-crawling experience. In 2002, Arcane Studios released a spiritual successor to the Ultima Underworld series, titled Arx Fatalis. As usual, I'll be starting with one of the versions currently available, and that is the one downloaded by default on GOG. In the dimly lit corridors, a robed figure begins to speak, imploring those who listen to take heed of his words. He begins explaining the history of Arx, a great city led by the just King Fatalis. After the death of the king in the year 226, the sun began to mysteriously disappear, casting an eternal winter over the entire world. The son of Fatalis, the young King Landshire, commanded the city to be moved underground into an abandoned dwarven mine. All of the differing races began to work together to ensure their survival, moving all of their settlements underground, in a feat which took 5 long years, during which the sun completely disappeared from the skies. Soon after this mass migration, the ancient tensions between the races began to flare up again, each race withdrawing into their own strongholds. As the robed figure begins to speak of a new threat, a ratman stabs him in the back, killing him. Despite the attempts to apprehend this assassin, the guards are unsuccessful, and the ratman uses a magical sigil to escape from their grasp. After this action-packed introduction, which leaves many questions floating in the air, you find yourself in the main menu. The most important part of the menu is the options section. The first page available is the video options menu, where you can choose the resolution, including widescreen resolutions, though in this version, those merely stretched the 4:3 rendered game into the wider resolution. You can also change some basic level of detail options and tinker with a few options that allow you to modify the brightness and contrast of the game. The second menu contains the audio settings, which has 4 volume sliders and a toggle for EAX, in case you have compatible hardware, or more likely an EAX emulator software installed, enabling better 3D audio. The important volume sliders are SFX, speech, and ambient. And especially with the setup I have, the speech was by default extremely low compared to everything else, so I ended up lowering the SFX and ambience level so I could actually hear the speech properly. Finally, there is the control configuration, where the first page is about mouse control settings, including basic options such as whether invert mouse is on, mouse sensitivity options, and so on. The second control configuration page is to set up your keybinds, of which there are quite a few. To begin the game itself, you first need to create a character. You begin with a blank slate of sorts, with all of the attributes and skills at their minimum levels, and you're given a set amount of points to allocate to each of the categories. There are 4 available attributes, which are Strength, Mental, Dexterity, and Constitution, each of which affect the initial stats of skills linked to the attributes. There are also 9 skills, which can be divided into 3 categories that loosely conform to the traditional RPG tropes of Rogue, Mage, and Warrior. But you're not locked into any specific path, and can mix and match skills. Thus, you can create a character who is good at spellcasting and also lockpicking, or you can create a strong but stealthy warrior. This kind of freedom is very much appreciated. To make character creation a little bit easier for people who haven't read the somewhat extensive manual included with the game, hovering over an attribute or skill gives a rather detailed description of what it does at the top of the screen. After allocating your skills, you can also choose your character's appearance from 4 masculine presenting avatars and launch into the game, which begins in a somewhat confusing fashion. Your newly created avatar finds themselves in a hallway, naked and shouting in agony while being enveloped in some kind of energy, and then they pass out and are dragged away by a goblin into a prison cell. Here you wake up, gain control of the character, and can begin the tutorial. From the very first moments of the game, inspirations from the Ultima and even System Shock are apparent. You begin in what the game calls cursor mode. In this mode, most of the user interface elements are on the screen, and you control a gauntlet-shaped cursor which can be used to interact with both the user interface and the world. The first thing the game highlights is a book at the right-hand side of the screen. Clicking on this book opens your journal, which initially opens on your character sheet. displaying all of your skills, attributes, and other related statistics, while also displaying a 3D model of your chosen avatar. The bookmarks at the top of the book can be used to change categories, of which the currently available ones are an auto map that is basically blank, and a tutorial messages section, which can be used to reread tutorial pop-ups the game has shown you. These tutorial pop-ups guide you through the initial segments of the game, and little by little teach you how to play, but in a way that they can be ignored if you're already familiar with the game, and can just go through the motions quickly to get into the game proper. The first tutorial pop-up explains that right-clicking will swap between the cursor mode and mouse look mode. Changing into the mouse look mode turns the game's controls to a more familiar style, as the leather belt at the bottom of the screen vanishes, and instead of a cursor, you now control the camera in a way you'd expect in a first-person game. Most of the basic controls are standard PC controls. WASD move your character around, and you can crouch and jump as well. There is also a lean function with Q and E, and the shift button acts as sneak mode, or in other words, a walk button. The movement feels somewhat floaty, and the explanation to that can be found when looking down, where you can see your feet, a feature which I'd appreciate seeing more in video games. While in cursor mode, you can still move around and look around the world. The movement keys still move the character around normally while in this mode, but to look around and turn, you either need to use the bound looking around buttons or hover the mouse cursor at the edges of the screen, which turns the camera in that direction. As you learn to move around, the person in the adjoining cell calls out to you and implores you to find a way to escape, as he's been unable to find one in his cell. This first interaction also introduces the player to the main character, who is very much a blank slate still, and seems to know nothing of the world or themselves.
My memory, it's gone. I remember nothing. Not even my own name. What did I come here to do?
The gobblers probably crept up on you from behind.
Having an amnesia character doesn't feel like the most original idea, but it's undeniable there is a benefit to having the character not know of the world, as this gives the player a good analog to learn of the complex world while having the game give you plenty of exposition without it feeling too out of place within the context of the story, which is sometimes a difficult thing to get right.
What's a paladin?
The first bit of dialogue also shows the curious design choices made with this system, as not only do you have no dialogue choices, but the subtitles slowly scroll up within the black letterbox space at the bottom of the screen, leading to a situation where often a large portion of the audible dialogue has already happened before any of the text is actually readable. I don't mind the former too much, but the latter is an absolutely fascinating decision that I could live without. Looking around the cell, you can find a stone which glows blue. This is how objects in the world are highlighted whenever they are located by your intuition skill, and this stone acts as your introduction to the object manipulation system. To move the stone, you merely need to point at it with your crosshair and hold the left mouse button. This changes the stone into move mode, and you can place the movable object where you point. Placing the object is made easier by having a version of the object act as a guide to its eventual placement. However, if you try to move the object outside a certain radius or above any physical objects the item can be placed on, the cursor changes slightly, and instead of placing the object, you throw it. A large amount of objects can be moved around the world in this fashion, and it adds quite a lot to the immersive nature of the world. After moving the rock, the game teaches another way to interact with the world, as you're directed to double-click the metal bars the stone was holding in place, causing you to bend the bars and create a way out of your cell. Immediately after squeezing through the bars, the game teaches you how to equip items by highlighting a bone on the floor and directing you to press the use key while pointing at it. This instantly transfers the bone into your equipped weapon slot, and the bone is now usable as a makeshift club, which is very important since in the adjoining room you're face to face with your first opponent, a lone goblin. To defend yourself against the enemy, you need to enter combat mode. In this mode, the user interface changes once more, and your equipped weapon is raised and shown prominently on the screen. Another important element is the gem in the middle of the bottom section of the screen. Combat works in a very similar fashion to Ultima Underworld. To ready your weapon, you press and hold the left mouse button, which begins to charge the power gem in your user interface. The brighter the gem is, the more potential damage your strike will have. You can also do different kinds of strikes depending on which movement direction you press as you begin holding the attack button. After dispatching the enemy, you can loot its corpse, which is a good moment to explain a bit about the inventory system. As you double-click the goblin's body, the cursor mode activates, and the activated container is shown as a leather pouch at the top left of the screen. Your personal inventory is shown at the bottom of the screen in the shape of a long leather belt. Both of these are segmented into a grid, which to me is absolutely fantastic. To pick up items from the goblin's inventory, you can either click and drag the item and place it freely into your inventory, or you can shift-click the item, which immediately moves the selected item to the first free slot in your inventory. Some items can be stacked, and you can either move items from the stack one by one or move the entire stack at once. Some items take more than one slot, but cannot be rotated. So the game is partially lacking in the inventory Tetris department. You can also remove items from your inventory using the same system that was used in moving the stone in your cell, and you can either place an object from your inventory into the world or throw it. Once done with the looting, you can finally free your fellow captive, who conveniently gives you a new name, of which your character is clearly excited about.
Thank you, Shigar. If you can't remember your name, you better keep this one.
Shigar. Yes, I'll keep this name for now.
He introduces himself as Kultar, a member of the Guild of Travelers, a group of people who brave the sunless winter of the surface to maintain trade and communications between different underground settlements. As the final step of the basic tutorial, the game instructs you on how to crouch and demonstrates the limited destructibility of the environment by having you smash a grating on the floor, revealing a pathway to the second, more open tutorial segment. Having fallen into the hole, you surprisingly enter the next level without any broken bones, and find yourself in a very traditional-looking dungeon setting, which is very appropriate since the game's DNA is heavily based on the history of dungeon crawlers. Unlike in the very linear initial tutorial segment, in this portion one aspect of the user interface becomes important, as the top right corner of the screen displays an automatically filling minimap of the area, though this element can be turned off if for some reason you choose that's important. Despite there being multiple pathways to explore, the level is still closed off enough that the player can be expected to find certain tutorial triggers as they explore the area. First of which is almost undoubtedly the introduction of the magic system, as you find a corpse containing runes that can be added into your spellbook. In many ways, the magic system is practically a carbon copy of the magic system of the Ultima Underworld games, and the basis of it revolves around finding runes that you can add into your spellbook. Each of these runes represents a word of power, and combining these words is how spells are cast. Having the first two runes, you can open up your journal to the spellbook category, where you can see the collected runes and any unlocked spells, of which there is currently only one, called Ignite. By clicking on a spell in your spellbook, you can add a reminder to the user interface on which runes are needed to cast the chosen spell. How to actually cast the spell is really fascinating, and probably one of the features people aware of the game remember the most, and it requires you to activate yet another new control mode by holding the magic button. Doing so raises your character's arm and unlocks the cursor from the mouse look. The cursor is then used to draw a stream of magical energy on the screen, and the player is required to form the shapes of the desired runes with this magical energy. Each successful drawing has a low distorted voice say the word of power related to the rune, and the drawn rune is added to a guide which displays the successfully drawn runes during this casting. Once you've drawn the runes of the spell and release the casting button, you automatically cast the spell, as long as the spell actually exists and you have enough mana, displayed in the bottom right corner of the screen. Since the drawing of the runes is not particularly fast, and sometimes the rune recognition is a bit finicky, you can likely see how this is not the most viable way to use spells during combat. That too has been taken into account, and it's possible to memorize spells in advance by holding the sneak button while casting the spell. Doing so adds the spell to one of your 3 spell slots, which can then be cast by using the appropriate hotkey without any additional rune drawing. Despite the system not always being the most functional, I absolutely adore this. Sure, from a purely gameplay perspective, it's not the most pleasant way to cast spells, and especially during combat you're severely limited in your ability to use spells effectively. But, in my opinion, that's kind of a good thing, as this system emphasizes preparation and immersion, both of which are some of my most favorite things in video games. Next to the runes, you can find your first piece of armor, which can be equipped in the same way weapons are equipped, by pressing the action button while hovering over the piece of armor. This removes the armor from your inventory and inserts it onto your character, which can be seen in the character sheet section of the player's journal. In this screen, it's possible to equip and unequip items by dragging and dropping them to and from your character. Around this 3D model are the current stats pertaining to your attack and defense potential. Wading through the occasionally dark hallways, which can conveniently be lit with a first spell taught to you, you eventually find a room with a broken elevator, which the game rather bluntly tells you to fix. Since it's unlikely you have the means to do so as you first find this room, this leads to the majority portion of the level, which is about exploration. This, in my opinion, is a good way to slowly get the player accustomed to the kind of gameplay they're going to experience for the duration of the story, starting with a very linear and small set piece in the prison, and expanding that to a slightly larger set piece where you're still locked in until you complete an objective, and have to explore multiple hallways with easily defeated enemies to find the things you need to travel further into the dungeons. If exploring thoroughly, it's possible to find an unlit campfire, which as well can be conveniently lit with a spell you were taught. Here, the tutorial pop-ups teach you the basics of the cooking system, which in many ways can be seen as a completely unnecessary addition, but I absolutely love it when games have these kinds of little details in them. How the basic cooking functions is that you need a big enough fire, and then you drag raw food from your inventory near that fire, and once the physics engine causes the dropped item to stop, it becomes uninteractable until it has been fully cooked, after which you can pick up the finished food item. Once you find more items, it's possible to combine them into new food items, such as using water and flour to make bread dough, which can be flattened to make a pie base, and so on and so forth. It's completely unnecessary to have cooking that goes even this deep into the process, but to me, it's absolutely fantastic. Food does serve a valuable purpose though, as you can eat food to replenish some of your health. It's not the most effective means of healing, and quite often the passive healing while exploring is enough to completely restore your health between engagements. But eventually you will also get hungry, which not only stops the passive healing, but begins to slowly drain your health if you neglect eating for a long enough time, making the direct healing of eating the least useful aspect. It's also possible to find a more traditional fantasy means of healing yourself in the form of healing potions. These are obviously more potent than just eating food, and as having multiple different food types in your inventory takes quite a lot of space, having a means of healing which stacks into one slot and also heals more is very convenient. Further exploration can also gain you your first magical scroll, which acts as a means to cast a spell without knowing the appropriate runes, or without the required casting skill. Eventually, you'll find a rope which is required to move past this tutorial segment. To use the rope to fix the broken elevator, you're taught to double-click on the object you want to use, which changes the look of the cursor into use mode. While in this mode, you can click on whatever you wish to use the chosen object on. One interesting part about the segment, which the game doesn't explicitly teach, is that of secrets. Paying attention to the minimap can reveal hidden passages, and sometimes you can access these passages immediately after finding them. One of these secrets is in the elevator room, and the tutorial does not actually explain how to access this secret. Instead, it's left up to the player to find out how to open the passage. If the player decides to take on this challenge, the game can introduce yet another new feature, as the elevator room has two pressure pads on the floor, one of which is depressed by a pile of rubble. Using what has already been taught, it's possible to remove the rubble and see the pressure plate get raised. After this, pressing the other pressure plate opens a secret door leading into the new passage. I kinda wish the game would have been more obvious about this, since as much as I personally enjoy finding all kinds of secrets and figure out little puzzles like this, in my opinion, it's still better if the first simple puzzle leading to a secret is somehow telegraphed to the player in a relatively obvious way. Doing this primes the player to be more aware of their surroundings in the future, as the game has directly taught the player that there can be secrets, and little puzzles may be required to access them. For those who noticed the secret and decided to investigate, this room acts as a very good way to incentivize further exploration, since the room is full of useful items, including a rope that can be used to repair the elevator, in effect removing the requirement to explore the rest of the dungeon floor. At this point, it's also very likely that you've gained enough experience to level up, signified by a sound effect and a new tutorial pop-up, which directs you to press a new icon on your user interface, a red cross which instantly opens your journal to the character sheet page. Leveling up functions in a standard RPG fashion, and each level requires a certain amount of experience points, which can be gained from reaching certain quest milestones, by killing enemies, and so on. Once you've gained a new level, you're given a certain amount of points to allocate to both your attributes and skills. Doing this functions in the exact same way as during the character creation, with the exception that you cannot remove points you've added, as each point you add is considered spent, and there is no confirmed choices option to lock in the point allocation you've chosen. This is a bit of a shame, as it would be nice to be able to experiment and see how point allocations affect other linked skills, and so on, before confirming your choices. But it's not a big negative. At the end of the tutorial, you're faced with what could be seen as a mini-boss, with a huge goblin blocking your way. Thankfully, Kultar joins you, while the game doesn't explain some features which can be used to make this fight even easier. The first time playing through this segment, it's more than likely the player will just fight their way through, but it's also possible to heal your friend and even give him a weapon. Neither of these options are explicitly stated. Even the manual, which has a short walkthrough of the tutorial segment, doesn't mention this possibility. Instead, it directs the player to use the magic scroll against the enemy. On one hand, it's a massive shame the game isn't more direct about some of the features it has, which can lead to players being completely unaware of the depths of the options they have available. The absolutely positive part is that this depth still exists, even if it's not telegraphed particularly well. It's also possible to not help Kultar at the beginning of the game, in which case he does not appear to help you with the fight, which is another great example of how little things can have an effect on how certain things in the game play out, and the game doesn't really draw any attention to when you've made one of these decisions. I kinda love it, because it can lead to being surprised about how your choices matter. But the way no attention is brought to these decisions also means that it's easy to believe there are no such decisions, and the game is merely very linear with a set of pre-made events that always play out the same way. The end of the tutorial leads you into a stairway to another level of the caverns, which functions in an interesting way. In Ultima Underworld, to move between levels, you merely walked into a doorway, which instantly teleported you into the new area. In Arx Fatalis, the stairs are actual stairs, which can lead to an illusion of, if I'll just walk up these stairs, I'll be where I wanna be. That is not the case, and eventually, your way will be blocked by an impenetrable invisible wall. To actually change floors, you need to enter cursor mode and click a change level icon at the top right corner of the screen, which then initiates the level transfer and brings up a loading screen. I find it kinda curious that it's not automatic after bumping into the invisible wall, but needs to be manually initiated. This is not the best design in my opinion, though I presume it's to avoid accidental level transitions during an era where the loading times would have been far longer than they are with modern hardware. Still, it would be nice to at least have the option to turn off the manual level transfer confirmation, or if bumping the wall would have an actual pop-up asking whether you want to change the level or not. Either of those choices would have been more clear and functional, in my opinion. The next level is still a part of the Goblin Kingdom, and you're not yet out of harm's way. This is also where I stopped playing the default version downloaded from GOG and installed Arx Libertatis, an open source port of Arx Fatalis with more support for modern hardware and some new features such as the ability to adjust the view for widescreen resolutions, user interface scaling, and a new rune recognition system for the magic. Why I did this is because the GOG version did begin to show some unpleasant behavior, specifically freezing for a moment and then speed warping to whatever state the game would be had it not frozen. This caused some fights and exploration to become disorienting, as I ended up warping past hallways and being confused as to where I ended up. These issues don't seem to be present in Arx Libertatis, and since it uses the original game as the base, it still seems very accurate to the original game, and as such, from this point onwards, all of the footage will be from that version. The second level of the Goblin Kingdom begins with one final introduction of a major feature: stealth. Enemies can both see and hear you, both of which you can mitigate by moving slowly, in the shadows, and peeking behind corners instead of just walking into full view. This is very much useful, as keeping a low profile will allow you to eavesdrop on enemies and potentially get more information about your quests or the world, or, at the very least, hear some world building.
You know why gray goblins have mustaches? No. To remind them of their mothers. Isn't that funny, huh?
Not funny. Me mother is Grey Goblin.
Right.
If an enemy does hear you, they will investigate, and likely eventually enter full hostile mode, leading to combat. In combat as well, a new feature is introduced, as when you harm an enemy enough, it's possible they will disengage and try to escape, and potentially alert their friends, who will then accompany the wounded enemy and investigate the position you were last seen at. This is quite fantastic, and adds a new element of danger whenever you're fighting more intelligent enemies with means of communicating. Obviously, leaving the tutorial doesn't mean things are about to get easy, or extremely open, and your freedom of exploration is initially limited to a somewhat small area of the level, with some doors leading further being locked and some being blocked by other means. One of which is a portcullis, where a goblin guard demands to see your gem dealer's license, or they will not let you pass. Still, this is where the game slowly begins to open up, and it's up to the player to find more things about what to do and why. After all, up to this point, you have no idea who you are, barely know where you are, and have no idea what you're supposed to do besides survive and escape from the goblins. While trying to do so, it's possible to discover another goblin prison, this time inhabited by another goblin called Pulsius, who wants to be free and promises to help you if you do so. You may also stumble upon a rather gruesome sight, clearly showing how the goblins' apparent lack of intelligence doesn't preclude them from being particularly violent, as their torture room is splattered with blood and severed human parts. In this room is also a locked door, the key to which seems very elusive, acting as a potential revelation for many players, as by this point it's also very likely you've found your first set of lockpicks. Picking locks is pretty simple. You merely double-click the set of picks in your inventory and then target the lock you wish to pick. This plays a lockpicking sound effect, after which a voice line from Shiva describes whether you were successful or not, or if the lock is too complicated for your skill level.
Not really a very successful attempt.
Lockpicks are reusable, but they do have a durability rating, which is lowered each time you fail a lockpicking attempt, acting as an incentive to either save scum or keep improving your technical skill level as much as possible to avoid losing this somewhat uncommon resource. If you do succeed in picking the lock, you're rewarded with a new piece of armor and other valuable loot. Each piece of equipment you have has a durability rating, and their approximate condition is shown in your user interface as an icon which changes color based on how much durability the piece has remaining. If an item breaks, it is gone, so this is not a desirable outcome. In the locked room you can find an anvil, which can be used to repair your damaged equipment. How much durability can be restored depends on your skill level. This is obviously a very useful feature, and Ultima Underworld veterans might have the urge to open their journal to the map page and add a marker to remind them where the anvil is. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any means of adding personal markers, which in a game like this is a massive shame. Finally escaping the Goblin Fortress, either by using excessive force or by stealth, you end up in a new cavern and encounter a sign that not everything is alright in the world, as the entire cavern begins to shake. Further in, the cut-stone hallways turn into natural rock formations, signifying you've finally left the fortress properly. But soon enough, another fortress appears before you, and not everything seems to be right. Human corpses litter the entrance to this fortress, and clear signs of intense fighting implore you to explore further. Inside, a survivor asks you to find the commander of the fortress while displaying one of the worst parts of the game. As mentioned before, the audio mixing is absolutely horrendous sometimes, and I had to turn down the volume of everything but speech to make many voice lines properly audible. It doesn't help that subtitles only appear in very specific dialogue scenes, and not in cutscenes or during these non-dialogue screen speeches.
At last, the reinforcements. Go and see Ortian immediately.
Practically everyone in the fortress is dead, and the walls are covered in soot and blood, showing how not only were the attackers powerful, but they clearly were versed in the use of magic. The commander of the fortress more or less confirms this and calls the attackers Ilcits, powerful and fierce warriors who attacked the fortress without any provocation. He implores you to go to the human kingdom to warn the king. This has been made more difficult as the earthquakes have collapsed the direct connection between the outpost and the human kingdom. Regardless of this dire situation, Shagar is not particularly enthusiastic about the proposition.
Find someone else to help. I have my own problems to deal with.
Still, you receive a gem dealer's license, which you're told should give you safe passage through the Goblin Outpost, from where you can find a longer passage into the human lands. And so, another quest has now been thrust on you, whether you like it or not. In the nearby tavern, you can find more help, and quite a bit of exposition. A tavern patron suggests you may be a part of the Travelers Guild, and are experiencing what amounts to PTSD, giving you a quest to find this guild. The upper level of the tavern is home to the gambling mechanic, which in essence is a simplified version of roulette. You move your tokens on the table to the number you wish to bet on, and then spin a wheel and hope for the best. Your chances of winning are just as high as you'd expect, and losing all of your money is a possibility, which may lead to homicidal rage and the attempted murder of the gambling attendant.
I'm sure you'll have better luck next time.
This will most likely not end well, and death is very likely. In Arx Fatalis, death is the end. You don't get a dramatic ending cutscene, nor will you be resurrected. Instead, you will be somewhat unceremoniously booted into the main menu. This obviously means you need a means to not lose that progress, and to help with that, you can save and load whenever and wherever you want. This otherwise very basic save system does have one feature which I wouldn't mention if it was a standard, but it's not, as you can name your saves. I don't understand why this isn't more common. I can kind of understand it for console games where a lot of people don't have keyboards attached, and typing on the on-screen keyboard would slow down saving quite a lot, but on the PC? Why isn't this the norm for basically every game? You also have quick save and quick load slots, the amount of which can be determined in the Arx Libertatis options menus. Being able to save when you wish with one press of a button if you want to is very important, since there is no auto-save system in place, and as such, you can lose all of your progress if you neglect saving frequently. Back in the tavern, Polsius the Goblin explains why he was imprisoned. The goblins had made a pact with priests to someone or something called Akbar, who feasts on the living humans. The goblins were to supply humans to someone called Lord Zerbius, and in exchange, they were compensated with gold. As much as this was initially a good deal for Polsius, he found out that the cult of Akbar intends to destroy the world, which would kill everyone, not only humans. As a businessman, Polsius realized that this would be pretty bad for the profit margins, and brought his concerns to the Goblin King, who disagreed with Polsius' assessment and had him imprisoned. To continue, you need to get Polsius to sign fake authorization papers, which is done with the only real way you can interact with other characters peacefully, by using an object on them, which acts as a combined show/give function. In many ways, I appreciate the quite simplistic way with which you engage with the environment, but I also see how it can feel very limited, as most non-combat functions are completely behind the double-clicking function, and there are no speech options. Overall though, it feels very functional, and the game still has a surprisingly large amount of options, even if not in every area that you might expect from a role-playing game. Some of these options become available once you pass through the Goblin Outpost and finally reach the human city of Arx. As you enter the city, the game enters cutscene mode, where two mysterious figures talk about how an energy flux has been detected on a world called Exhauster, and how this is somehow connected to beings called the Immortals, who seem to use these energy fluxes to meddle in the affairs of other dimensions. These figures seem to have some kind of a duty to prevent this kind of interdimensional meddling, and talk of sending a guardian to handle the affair. Whatever this means, we do not know. So instead of worrying about it, you end up in the human city of Arx. The main quest at this point tells you to go to the guard outpost to announce your presence, but you can also explore the city before doing so. And in many ways, that highlights some of the positive and negative aspects of how the game works. The city of Arx is the home of several shops, and also many friendly people who welcome you with open arms.
Leave me alone, or I'll call the guards.
Since the game doesn't have a dialogue system as such, that means that trading doesn't function through such an interface either. Instead, using shops is done via the basic inventory interface, and each shop has multiple chests on shelves which contain the wares of the trader. To purchase something, you merely pick up something from the chest, which automatically removes the amount of money the item costs from your purse, and now you're the happy owner of whatever you chose. Selling works in the same way, except in the opposite direction. You merely drag an item from your inventory into the trader's inventory, and that completes the transaction. The prices to buy and sell are shown on the cursor, and the numbers can be shown in either red or green. In the buy interface, green means you can afford the item, and red means you cannot. In the sell interface, green means the trader is willing to buy this item, and red means they are not. While going through the Goblin outpost, it was possible to find out that the goblins work together with trolls to facilitate a gem trade in the caverns. Currently, however, the trolls are on strike for an unspecified reason. The city's gem trader will explain how this is very much bad for business, and as such, gems are very expensive. Since this is a video game, you can guess that at some point it's more than likely that you will somehow end the troll strike to gain something completely unrelated. So with this knowledge, you can engage in some insider trading. The interactivity with the environment also means that you can buy a pickaxe, go into the gem-filled mines, and gather a large amount of gems for yourself, and then sell them for a rather hefty profit, especially for this point in the game. Using this profit, it's also possible to go to the bank and purchase shares to the troll mine, which are moderately cheap now since the mine is producing nothing, and no one knows how long the situation will last. Being able to do this kind of insider trading of sorts by using your prior knowledge of how video games tend to work is absolutely amazing, and I love that there's this level of detail involved in something that's not even a major plot point of the game. But this also leads to one of the more negative aspects. Time in Arx Fatalis does not move in a linear fashion, but it moves depending on how far in the main quest you currently are. This means that shops open and close depending on your progression, and the developers have been, let's be honest, a little bit assholish when it comes to this specific segment. If you go talk to the guards when you enter the city, they lead you to the King of Arx, and even give you a map marker to show where you should go. If you do this though, and think to explore the city later, well, most of the market manipulation is now outside your reach, since the gem dealer's shop is closed, and it's very much unlikely you can scrounge up the cash to purchase the shares to the mine. I love the freedom, but I'm not a fan of how some of these opportunities are so progression sensitive that it's unlikely that a first-time player would even properly realize they exist. This is one of the major problems of the game. It's so free and immersive and full of options, but seems to take as many opportunities as possible to obfuscate the existence of those options. One of those options appears soon after you have spoken with the King of Arx, who asks for your assistance in recruiting the trolls to clear the cave-in. To do so, the obvious first choice is to try and solve the reason for the trolls striking, which leads to a quest revealing more about the intricacies of the Society of the Goblins. You may also think to pickpocket the key, but might not have enough skill points to do so due to the limited amount of experience you've been able to gain by this point. Many actions in Arx Fatalis have minimum skill requirements, which tend to be rather high, especially at the beginning where you've gained a relatively small amount of skill points. In practice, this means that on your first playthrough, many options are inevitably out of your reach unless for some reason you've specifically decided to focus on leveling one skill and practically nothing else. On one hand, I dislike this immensely, since it means that during the first playthrough, it's very much possible that the player will just feel frustration, as they probably have spent points trying to make just the kind of character that can engage in the kinds of actions the game puts in front of them, but they just don't have enough points allocated to the required skills, since there was no indication that hyper-focusing on one skill would be in any way a good idea. This time though, pickpocketing is not an option, despite it seeming reasonable, as the key is unstealable regardless of how high your skill level is, leaving the only other option as the complete murder of every troll except the one imprisoned in their cell, turning an interesting moral choice into a choice of two extremes. After solving the troll problem, the King of Arx gives you your own room and hires you for yet another job, this time to investigate the murder of the lead astronomer Falan Orbiplenex. Having your own room in Arx is very useful. At this point in the game, it's very likely that you have noticed how limited the inventory space is, especially if you're in any way a loot goblin. The room is obviously a great place to stash your items that you may want to save for later, or just collect for the fun of it. Not only that, your room contains one of the best items in the game, a backpack. Activating the backpack consumes it, which adds another full page to your belt inventory, effectively doubling the available inventory space. The introduction of inventory expansions comes at a good point in the game, where the player is already painfully aware of the space limitations and might be getting worried about how annoying inventory management will be as the game goes on. Then, the game gives you a secure place to stash your excess items and a means to carry twice more stuff on your person. I like this introduction to the feature. Depending on your actions, the murder investigation is likely to introduce a puzzle aspect to the game involving combination locks, by giving you a note with a rather simple mathematical logic puzzle, which you need to solve to open a safe with the victim's notes. This leads to a scene with a massive dump of exposition, where you're told about a cult that intends to summon the god of destruction Akbar by using an ancient meteorite as a conduit to transfer power to Akbar and create a portal through which he could enter this dimension. And how a captain of the guard is suspected of being a high member of this cult and is now imprisoned in the castle jail. You're also told about interdimensional beings called the Nodin, whose purpose is to maintain balance between the worlds by ensuring that the immortals, of which Akbar is one, do not gain too much power on different planes. Because of this, the astronomer had contacted the Nodin, who sent another being called the Guardian to fight against this cult and destroy the meteorite being used as a conduit, and ensure that Akbar will not gain a foothold on Arx. However, no one knows what form this Guardian has taken, as in their home dimension they are beings of pure energy, so you are tasked to find this Guardian. To do so, you're given a piece of the meteorite ore the conduit is made out of, which is said to crumble and be destroyed when touched by a Guardian. As you reach for the stone, the most obvious plot twist happens.
Great heavens!
Welcome, Guardian. Allow me to explain your next mission.
Quite unsurprisingly, you are the Guardian, and touching the meteorite begins to restore your lost memories, as you see scenes of you being sent to Arx. I'm kinda glad that this revelation happens relatively early on in the game, as it's not really a difficult thing to figure out. You've been seeing visions of the Nodin, and Akbar himself sometimes taunts you in your mind, so hearing about this Guardian, it's very simple to assume, yeah, it's me, right? A bigger plot twist would have been if it would have been revealed you are not the Guardian, and are merely some schmuck who had his head bashed in by a goblin, causing you to lose your memory. Because of this obvious nature of the twist, it's good it was over with early on, instead of the game pretending to be more clever than it is by dangling the obvious future twist in front of you for hours and hours on end. With this revelation, instead of searching for the Guardian, your task is now to find the cult of Akbar and destroy their conduit, preventing the summoning of their deity. To help with this, you can talk with the imprisoned cultist, showing you how despite regaining their memories, our Guardian's personality hasn't exactly changed for the better.
Give me another good reason to spare your life, mortal.
I can help you.
Regardless of your interesting disposition, you gain some information, including how the member of the guard might not be a member of the cult, but was just desperate to bring back his dead wife, whom the cult promised the rituals he took part in would return. This was not the case, and the man was betrayed, and as such he feels no loyalty towards the cultists, and reveals to you a password into a secret lair from whence you might find more information. At this point, it's also possible to engage in another very useful feature, as long as you've leveled up the linked skill enough, as the castle's laboratory is now open, from where you can find a still. With a still, you can brew your own potions, each of which has a specific minimum skill requirement to brew. To make potions, you first need to harvest raw materials, which are conveniently color-coded to match with the color of the resulting potion. Once harvested, the raw materials need to be ground into dust with a mortar and pestle and placed into an empty bottle. This combination can then be used with a still to create new useful potions and poisons. I really like this system, and it's another means of making the player self-sufficient in the world of Arx, where resources are scarce and everything feels expensive. As you try to leave the castle, you're stopped by a snake woman who wishes to aid you in your quest in a limited capacity by teaching you a hidden spell which is not added to your spellbook but is instead written into your journal entries. This spell is a portal activator. On each of the levels you've explored so far, it's been possible to find circular constructs that seem to serve no obvious purpose. With this spell, you can activate these constructs. Once you've activated at least 2 of them, one of the sides lights up and becomes a portal through which you can quickly travel to the other activated portal. Since the game is about to properly open up, and many more levels will become accessible to Shigar, this is an extremely useful feature, and lowers the amount of walking you need to do while backtracking through the levels. It also means that as you go deeper and deeper into the caverns, these portals become an obvious checkpoint of sorts to look for as a marker of progress, giving you an easy way to pop back into town to repair and sell items and brew more potions. Arx Fatalis also has side quests, which in classic RPG fashion are often useful to take part in. For example, an early side quest deals with the cult of Akbar that has kidnapped the daughter of a town shopkeeper. There is absolutely nothing to prevent you from completely ignoring this quest and just letting the child die, or even sneaking into the cult's lair to watch her get killed. But obviously, as this is an RPG, the optimal way to complete these quests is usually the goody-two-shoes way, which gives you experience, rewards, and makes people like you more. Infiltrating the cult of Akbar is relatively straightforward, and while you can get into their lair without violence, inside you're forced to fight in the narrow corridors. Here the game also begins to ramp up the frequency of puzzles required to proceed, clues to which are liberally supplied through notes found from corpses of the enemies you've slain. Eventually, you reach the meteor, where the leader of the cult is about to sacrifice a young woman. Thankfully, you're just in time to prevent him from doing so, but the priest doesn't seem that bothered about this fact. This culminates in what could be called a boss fight, as the priest summons a powerful demon you have to defeat. After doing so, you free the fair maiden and finally destroy the meteor, preventing Akbar from infiltrating Arx.
I don't believe it. I thought I'd be able to destroy this. How can it be too powerful for me?
Well, obviously things can't be that simple, and while you know the location of your final goal, you're currently unable to do anything about it. Back at the castle, more exposition ensues, and you're told the meteor is now fully attuned to Akbar, and instead of destroying the meteor, you merely transferred some of your power to the God of Destruction. To prevent this from happening in the future, allowing you to complete your purpose, you need to find a magical item split into 2 pieces, Crowhaz and Zahork. One being held by the ancient order of the Snake Woman, and one that has been lost for 20 years, stolen by a rebel faction of humans who stormed the castle and murdered the queen and kidnapped the princess. Your only option to find the magical object is to find these rebels, but you're not given much information to help, so you do the only thing you can and return into the caverns to explore. Soon you encounter the lady you rescued and explain to her what your current quest is. After hearing this, she implores you to follow her, which leads to you getting clobbered and being dragged deeper into the caverns. The woman reveals that she's in fact the leader of the so-called rebel faction, and insinuates that the story about what happened 20 years ago is not necessarily entirely true. She does confirm they have one half of the magical object and proposes a trade. The rebels are against the cult of Akbar, so you have a common goal, but she's unwilling to merely hand you the magical object and demands something equally powerful in return: a magical shield of a champion, buried deep within the crypts of Arx. The crypts are a dangerous place and house even more puzzles than the previous main story segment, this time with clues mostly within the environment, rather than written down on notes. Continuing the trend of how different features evolve little by little and gain more complexity, slowly teaching the player how to properly take advantage of the gameplay. Not only that, the crypts introduce the concept of undead enemies, which cannot be killed in a traditional way, as merely bashing enemies with your weapons will have them eventually resurrect. To prevent this from happening, you need to stake the undead after knocking them out. Unfortunately, stakes are not necessarily easily found, especially if you decided to completely wipe out 2 goblin factions on one of the cavern levels, leading to the massacre of traders who sell stakes. Again, another almost invisible consequence of the choices you can make in the game, which can lead into frustration instead of understanding of, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that one thing before. You can find some in the crypts and also some pieces of wood, which can be carved into stakes using basically any blade you can obtain. However, these pieces of wood are also used to repair levers, leading to uncertainty whether it's a good idea to actually get rid of these objects. Still, for the most part, it's completely possible to avoid the vast majority of the enemies, as zombies tend to be very slow, so you're not required to completely incapacitate them. It just makes your life a lot easier if you can do so. Eventually, you locate the magical shield and can bring it back to the leader of the rebels, who explains that she's in fact the daughter of the king of Arx, and the rebels are in fact a sort of secret service whose entire purpose is to protect the royal bloodline. Thanking you for your deed, she gives you permission to take Crowhaz, one half of the magical pair you need. The second half is in the possession of the Snake Women, who also require you to complete a quest for them. This one even more focused on puzzle solving, as you need to progress through the Temple of Illusions, where each room is in essence a small puzzle preventing you from progressing further. With both of the magical rings in your possession, you can wear them and be immune to the magical draining effects of the meteor. And so, you return to the Temple of Akbar, which is now even more dangerous than before. The Ilsids who attacked the first human fortress you saw during your quest are in fact working for the cult of Akbar, and they're a massive jump in difficulty compared to anything previously encountered. In fact, if you're not appropriately prepared, accidentally aggroing more than one of them at a time is almost certain to lead to a swift and painful death. This does highlight another aspect of the choices and consequences design of Arx Fatalis, however, as if you thoroughly explored the temple during your first visit, it's possible to enter the meteor room via a back door, and basically avoid almost all of the Ilsid warriors. Of course, this means that you'll also avoid gaining experience from those fights, but it's an option if the fights seem too difficult. At the meteor room, you finally touch the meteor and manage to destroy it. Unfortunately, you were too late, and Akbar's power has grown so much that he's still a threat. Thinking that perhaps the scholars of Arx can help you figure out what to do next, you return to the human fortress and are faced with even more Ilsid warriors, who've taken over the fortress and imprisoned the king. This sequence most likely results in moderately long periods of time standing in a corner waiting for your health and mana to recover between engagements, since the Ilsids are many and, even for a reasonably leveled character, dangerous adversaries. You reach the castle prison and find out it was all a trap. The Ilsids care not for the king or the humans, but they wanted to trap you instead. One of the Ilsids taking part in this plot is Kultar, the fellow prisoner from the beginning, and depending on your choices during the tutorial segment, he will either be hostile or friendly towards you. If the latter, he will open an escape route for you and removes his armor, as he's now seen the error in judgment he made when deciding to work for the cult of Akbar, explaining that the promise of the cult that Akbar would restore the sun to the skies was a very appealing proposition, especially for one whose life has been spent wandering the dark and cold world outside of the caverns. This is also where the lack of proper game balancing really shows its ugly head. During gameplay, you've been able to find all kinds of armor, possibly even pieces you're unable to wear due to very high strength requirements. None of that really matters after you get the Ilsid armor set, since it has multiple times more defense than the second most powerful armor. And it also has no durability, meaning it's completely indestructible. There's basically no good reason to wear anything else after finding this set, and with how large the increase in defense is to any armor you might be wearing, it's easy to feel like the minor upgrades prior to this point were almost a waste. Since the Ilsits were only after you, once you've escaped their grasp, they leave the human fortress, and everything returns almost to normal, finally allowing you to discuss your predicament with the scholars at the castle, who direct you to craft an ultimate weapon, which is the only thing capable of severing Akbar's connection to his home dimension, thus leaving him vulnerable. This quest leads you to the rest of the unexplored levels of the caverns, and doesn't really introduce many new features, but has some interesting set pieces. For example, the lowest levels of the caverns are the home of the dwarves, who dug too deep, awakening an ancient evil you cannot kill via direct means, and instead have to engage in small puzzle involving dwarven machinery. Forging the ultimate weapon as well is kind of a small puzzle, requiring you to follow instructions on how to operate the dwarven machines to create the metal and the sword. Once finished, you also need to use the one new feature that's prominently introduced in this segment: weapon enchanting. Using the enchant object spell, it's possible to create all kinds of interesting combinations, such as indestructible weapons or armor with slightly more defense, and so on. The problem is that this feature is introduced way too late in the game, and at this point it's practically useless. Once you've gained the Illicit armor and done the required enchantment for the ultimate weapon, there's practically no reason to ever use the enchanting feature, as the Illicit armor is more powerful than any enchanted armor you can make and is already indestructible. It also can't be improved further with the enchanting feature. The same applies to the weapon, and once you have the ultimate weapon, that very much is that, and no weapon you can enchant could be better than an indestructible weapon with massively more damage output than basically any other weapon you could find. It's really a shame that the enchantment is introduced so late, since it would have been extremely useful earlier in the game, but now it feels like a vestige that could have been a great feature, but ends up being completely useless aside from the main story requirement. With the best gear acquired, you can finally storm the Illicit fortress, wade through the difficult enemies, and reach the inner sanctum where the mutated High Priest Iserbius awaits you, already in progress of summoning Akbar. So you strike, but too late to completely end the summoning, leading to a final boss fight with a merged Akbar Iserbius entity. Unsurprisingly, this fight is the most difficult battle in the game, and can feel almost impossible with how much damage some of Akbar's spells do, and with how much damage he can withstand. Even if you do end up figuring out how to cheese him, the fight still takes a hefty amount of time. With Akbar defeated, you've saved Arx, and are already pondering how to continue your journey and how to help the people of Arx. This is not to be, however, as your master arrives to take you back home. The rules of the Node state that a guardian who's completed their mission must return back home. You've become too powerful, and a being this strong should not be living amongst the mortals. The Master also alludes to a possibility that not all you've heard about the sun and the outside world might be quite as you've been led to believe, as images of a settlement on the surface are shown. Now your quest is over, and the mortals are left to fend for themselves in a world no longer threatened by complete destruction, and you return to the stars. Arx Fatalis is, well, pretty good. It's far from perfect, but there's a lot to like about it. The world of Arx is very interesting, and you can see similarities to the Ultima series in some aspects. For example, Shigar the Guardian is a clear analogue of the Avatar, a being from another world who's called into action to save the world from a great evil, quickly becoming more powerful than basically anyone else in the world. Unlike Ultima, however, Arx Fatalis at least gives this a proper explanation, instead of leaving it as a suspension of the disbelief aspect of the story. You're also not given an explanation to everything, and in fact, things like the sun's disappearance and the nature of said disappearance are left open, potentially as something that could have been explored in a sequel. But what you do get is a curious world full of familiar fantasy creatures with their own societies and interconnections between these societies. There are political struggles and war, and once the races learned to survive underground, they all fell back into their old ways, just in a new setting, bickering and isolating while keeping some forms of trade alive. Just from the random dialogue that can be heard during gameplay, it's clear that most races really look to themselves as the superior ones, with everyone else beneath them. There's also the aspect of having other settlements and the Guild of Travelers, who are the key to maintaining communication and trade between the separate caverns. We never really meet the guild, nor do we see any of the other settlements. Once more, leaving a lot open for a potential sequel to cover. There's a lot more to the story that I didn't talk about, some aspects of which heavily depend on the choices the player makes, and in some senses it really feels like the actual battle against Akbar is secondary to the political struggles going on around the kingdom of the humans, and the other races working beside them. The story is not always written the best, however, and things like the revelation of the identity of the Guardian, or how the young rebel leader was in fact the Princess of Arx kidnapped 20 years prior to the events of the game, were really not that big surprises, and perhaps were telegraphed a little bit too well. Granted, the rebel leader being the princess wasn't directly telegraphed, as much as it's just so commonly used of a trope that it was basically impossible to not think of that as a possibility. You can also get a kind of romance between the princess and Shigar, which comes out of nowhere and is so out of place I was absolutely confused about why it was even included. But despite there being some choices I thought could have been done a lot better in how the story was presented, overall I found it very interesting, and I loved trying to learn more about the world and its inhabitants. This perhaps could have been easier with a dialogue system that allows the player to question the characters more, or even actually make choices within the dialogue. But you can't always have everything, and the style of presenting dialogue meant that Shigar had a set personality, which can be a useful feature to have when telling a story. Speaking of that personality, the voice acting of Shigar comes off as extremely disconnected from emotion, which at the start just feels like poor voice acting. The revelation that you're actually playing an incarnation of a being made of pure energy transported into Arx at least explains that aspect, since Shigar likely doesn't feel emotion in the same way humans do. So that voice direction at least makes some sense when the player is given the context for it. Still, that doesn't change the fact that it's still kinda funny. Some ways with which the setting of Arx is told is completely environmental, and each area tends to have its own visual style, which tells a lot about the inhabitants of the zone. Humans, for example, live in a fortress that has a very traditional European medieval look, just underground. The goblins live in a less sleek-looking dungeon reminiscent of traditional dungeon crawler settings, and so on. The visual distinction between the areas is a great example of how good the game looks for its time. Arx Fatalis could have had a very boring look, considering the entire game takes place within an underground cavern. But that didn't stop the developers from giving each of the areas its own character. Whether it's from clearly man-made structures which differ between the races, or from the caverns that have distinct looks depending on how deep into the ground they've been dug, or the flora and fauna that live in these caverns independent of the invasive species of all the surface dwellers taking root within these dark corridors. In fact, unlike a lot of games, the level designers have clearly put a lot of thought into the world, leading them to include things like toilets, that are basically just holes in the ground or on the ramparts, which a lot of level designers seem to avoid adding for some reason. The character and armor designs are also very distinctive, and every piece of equipment is easily discernible from each other. For example, most of the unique characters and races have quite a lot of personality. The visual detail of the characters extends to the combat system as well, and while that too is in many ways completely pointless from a gameplay perspective, the enemy models have a rudimentary form of limb dismemberment, and I do have to admit, it does feel nice to see a goblin head fly off into the distance after a good horizontal slice of your sword. I really like the audiovisual presentation of the game, where even your movement sounds change depending on the armor you wear, and there's practically no music in the game, but instead the background is full of ambient sounds, which create the mood for whichever area you're in. Whether it's having muffled sounds of people as you explore the city, or the lonely sounds of air moving within the caverns, peppered with the sounds of rats and other wildlife living within those corridors. I love it. The one part I don't like about the audio is the horrendous mixing of the speech, which sometimes is basically unintelligible. As I mentioned at the beginning, I had to severely lower the audio levels of everything but the speech to be able to hear all of those lines over the wailing of the wind, fire, and whatever else was going on in the scene at the moment. gameplay is mostly pretty good, with some parts that could have been designed to be less annoying. For example, shopping is very much that. Not only do you have to check every chest the merchant has for whatever you want to buy, instead of having a unified interface for everything, you also can't seem to purchase stacks, leading to just dragging and dropping one item at a time when wanting to buy things like healing potions. Add to this how you can't see your gold while you're buying things, but have to separately check it by hovering over your gold pouch. It makes the shopping interface just a little bit more annoying than it should have been. Jumping also seems very janky, and I ended up in situations where I was trying to jump, but for some reason the game just didn't do it, leading me to basically walk into a trap or fall off a cliff. Other than that, controlling Amshigar works basically as you'd expect from any first-person game, with some minor bugs such as getting stuck in geometry in very specific locations. And I have nothing special to say about the basic controls of the game. The magic system, on the other hand, I absolutely love, and on one hand, I wish it had been used in more games, but I also kind of understand why it isn't as common. Drawing the runes to cast spells just feels immersive to me, and because of this system it forced me to try and memorize several of the rune combinations of spells I knew I wanted to use, which is much more fun to me than just applying an icon onto a hotbar. Of course, this system is also not the most easy to use during combat, and it's easy to botch drawing a rune while you're also trying not to die. For this, there are 3 memorization slots that can be used, but due to the difficulty of the game, these 3 slots are rarely enough to last a complete encounter, especially during boss fights. The repair system is pretty good, but has one massive flaw. Whenever you try to repair something yourself, the item is restored to a certain amount of durability, and the maximum durability of the item lowers slightly. To completely restore an item and its maximum durability, you can also peruse the services of the city blacksmith, who perfectly restores an item for a fee. Where the problem lies is the durability system, as when an item reaches 0 durability, it's completely destroyed and removed from the world. This means that it's possible to completely lose a unique item by having it degrade too much. Where this problem really shines is quivers. There is a limited amount of quivers, and as such, arrows that you can purchase. The only way to get more is to repair these quivers at the blacksmith, which fully restores the arrow count of the quiver. In my opinion, this option wasn't made clear enough by the game, and due to the system where objects are deleted from the world, it's very much possible for a ranged-focused character to completely run out of arrows usable in the world, which is not optimal. If the objects wouldn't get deleted, but instead would enter a broken state, only repairable with the blacksmith, I wouldn't have any problems with the system. This aspect of scarcity plays into most aspects of the game, and in a way it's understandable. After all, you're exploring underground caverns where everything is limited, and barely anything grows except with the help of magical stones used for farming. This means that even reagents for magical potions and magical potions purchasable from the merchant tend to be limited, and it's impossible to just stack your inventory full of useful concoctions. With health and mana constantly restoring themselves, as long as you're fed, magic becomes something that's easily seen as an answer to this scarcity, as mana is basically infinite, while items are not. This also plays into the interactivity of the world, where you can pick up almost everything, and almost everything has at least one use within the game. Whether it's as a reagent for a magical potion, something to use as a weapon, or something to complete a puzzle with. You can even craft yourself a fishing pole and fish for food if you wish to do so, or use the forges of the world to craft yourself simple weapons. The one problem with some aspects of this interactivity come in the form of them becoming available too late, such as the enchantment I mentioned earlier being taught at a point where it's practically useless, or even the ability to craft weapons you're likely to find at the point where you already have weapons much more powerful than anything you can make. But it's still always appreciated when a game has these kinds of systems in place, since even if they are in practice pretty much useless, they still add to the immersion of the world, giving the player more of a feeling that they can do almost anything. Technically, you could even just kill everyone you find, break into every single place, steal absolutely everything, and still complete the game. But just like Ultima, the game gives you options, but sometimes makes those things be so difficult for a measly reward, or make you suffer other kinds of consequences to make you ponder, was this really worth it? Considering how much of the game is very much battle-oriented, being a rogue can feel very frustrating. There are only a few useful ways in which lockpicking can be used, and practically everything that leads to experience or good loot can be solved either with magic or with a key you can get. Stealth as well isn't nearly as useful as it could be, and often the primary uses of it revolve around doing things the hard way just because you want to do them like that, when the easiest way is to just do what others ask of you. Perhaps this is a commentary on how you're the Guardian and are meant to help people instead of being a selfish prick who just steals stuff. Or perhaps it's just suboptimal gameplay optimization. It doesn't help that it's very hard to fix your character if you've made choices you later regret, as during gameplay you might reach level 9 if you do almost everything you can, so there aren't too many options to add points to the skills of your character. This once more highlights the issue I've mentioned about how Arx Fatalis feels like a second playthrough kinda game, where the first time is painful, and on subsequent playthroughs you know better what kinds of characters work for the game, and can build your character appropriately and perhaps enjoy the game more. Inventory management in Arx Fatalis is potentially divisive, and there's so much stuff to loot in the game, and once more, during your initial playthrough, it's difficult to assess which things can be useful and which are going to be completely useless for you. Thankfully, relatively early on you get more inventory space, which can be expanded to 3 pages. That's pretty damn much in the end. The inventory interface itself could have done some work, and I was unable to find a way to change pages while holding an item, which is a thing I would have wanted to do to properly arrange my inventory without having to drop items. Change inventory page, and then pick the item back up just to move it to another page of my inventory. In a kind of Ultima fashion, keys are also a problem. Not only do they not have labels for the most part, there are a lot of keys in the game. It's also possible to miss the best feature regarding keys, as there seems to be only one key ring in the entire game. Thankfully, it's in the city general store, but with so many separate chests to wade through when browsing, it's still possible to miss the key ring, into which you can add every single key of the game while only using 1 square of inventory space. The difficulty of the game ramps up a bit too fast in my opinion, and once the illsids come into play, the game turns from a somewhat challenging game to a very difficult game very suddenly. This can come as a shock, and might be a source of frustration for players unaware of this difficulty jump. In my opinion, more balancing should have been done before release, but even still, eventually I learned how to manage the illsids somewhat safely. Fans have really gone above and beyond to maintain this game, and Arx Libertatis is an amazing application to have. Not only does it help with playing the game more comfortably on modern systems, the new magic rune recognition system turns the spellcasting from what I remember being an infinite source of frustration into something actually fun. Overall, even with its very obvious flaws, ranging from minor control issues to problems with the script, Arx Fatalis is still a very enjoyable game. And I'm kinda glad it didn't become Ultima Underworld 3, since as much as I do like Ultima, I do find the world of Arx more interesting, and wish there had been more done with the setting. Unlike most of the games I've covered, with this one there's actually some chance of that happening, since Arcane actually still exists, and is still doing critically well-received games, most of which I haven't yet played, but intend to. So, Arcane, you wouldn't have any more of the Arx Fatalis? Would you? Thanks to all of the monthly Patreon and Ko-fi supporters: Daniel Heinevetter, High Food Court, Iliad Drone, Paul Leone, The Bloke, Daniel Zupka, Kyriakos, Artheron, Zai, Andrew Juncker, Isaac Groves, and Professor Fessa. It's been really fun making these videos, and I'm very grateful for all of the support this project has received. This month has not been the easiest, and I'm glad I had something to take my mind away from the more negative things happening. Everyone who's been watching these or supporting the endeavor in any other way as well, thank you for making all of this possible. Next time we'll delve into a new series, possibly with a double episode at the start, which might take a while to make, but I'm excited to share yet another franchise that should be talked about more, and in some ways links to something I've covered before. But until then, thank you all for your support and patience. Fintrovert, signing out.